I'm Brian Redmond. I'm Curator of Archaeology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and we're talking about our recent excavations at the Heckelman site. The site is historically significant because of the four major prehistoric occupations there that now we have archaeological evidence for. Beginning as early as about 300 BC with what we call the early woodland period, followed by groups coming around 200 AD, the middle woodland period, again around 600 AD in the late woodland, and then finally not till about 1400 AD with groups we call late prehistoric or Sandusky tradition. The Heckelman site is located near Milan, Ohio, on the Huron River in Erie County, and is on a hilltop. It's on a flat bluff top. We have other sites like that across northern Ohio, but this one has been the most extensively excavated. The Heckelman site is what we call a hilltop enclosure, meaning these native people dug ditches to enclose about 2 acres of this bluff top. And there's really two types of enclosures that were made. One had to do with the digging of 2 long ditches, 2 parallel ditches, that basically form a side, or fourth side of an enclosure. And the other 3 sides are demarcated just by the steep bluffs that run around this piece of land, this flat ridge top along the Huron River. So we have parallel ditches that were dug, again, as probably for a symbolic ceremonial function. And then also we found the remains of an oval enclosure, which is very, very rare, unusual, really unheard of in northern Ohio. The shape being an oval is very unusual. And it enclosed a much smaller space within the larger enclosure. Our most recent studies deal with the earliest occupation, the early woodland time period. And as it turns out, the Heckelman site was occupied by people that were not living there in villages. They actually were there in what we think is a ceremonial center, conducting different ceremonies and rituals about 300 BC approximately. Well, what's interesting is in kind of different than what we see at contemporary sites in southern Ohio, what are called Adena culture, for example. At Heckelman site, they weren't performing what you call mortuary rituals or rituals related to burial of the dead. We found no burials at that site at that time period at Heckelman. We can't say what they were doing exactly during these rituals and ceremonies. We think that the hilltop enclosure at Heckelman had possibly some cosmological significance for the native people that had to do with their view about the world and the cosmos. And now we know from historic native peoples across North America that they looked at the world as 3 different levels: an underworld, a modern or living world where people exist, and the upper world above them. And it's very likely that this site was put on this high, flat hilltop, again overlooking the river, as if it was a model of this cosmos. We know, though, from the archaeological record that they were erecting these large poles or posts upright in the ground, might have been 10 or 12 feet high, based on the remains of the post, the holes from the post we find in the ground. And it seems that part of the rituals involves setting up 1 or more of these large poles, conducting ceremonies related to those, and then taking them back down again. We know they weren't parts of structures or buildings. They were actually freestanding posts that were used for these rituals. And really, this is some of the first evidence we have of those kinds of non-mortuary rituals during that period in much of Ohio, and particularly in northern Ohio. But we think the landscape had sacred meaning or significance because of what we found there archaeologically. We have found artifacts that dated to about 300 BC, pottery remains, stone tool remains, a small amount of food remains because there was some preparation of food and consumption of food, but we don't think it was in again, a domestic or like an everyday type of living. Well, the most interesting and probably unique thing are the discovery of these, the remains of these poles. Again, that aren't part of structures as we see in most other sites. So the remains of these poles, for example, don't consist of wood. Sometimes we find burned wood or charcoal in what we call post molds, which are the dark stains, the organic stains left behind in the soil from where the pole was either taken out and filled in with dark soil or left to rot in some cases. So the post molds are really the evidence we have of these wooden constructions, these poles that were being set up. So our work at Heckelman is a bit different because we spent 5 seasons, from 2009 to 2013, working at this very interesting, unique site. One is the fact that it is an early woodland ceremonial enclosure, which are not well understood at all across the region, particularly northern Ohio. Also the fact that we found good evidence of these enclosures, the 2 parallel ditches, and particularly the very unusual oval enclosure, again, is really not recorded anywhere in the region. Also, the artifacts that we found, the material that we were able to date to the early woodland period are important as well. And also the fact that this site, again, involved non-mortuary activities. It involved ritual and ceremonialism, but not of the kind you usually see in other parts of Ohio, again among Adena culture sites in southern Ohio. It shows that people were doing other things related to their beliefs that weren't just involved burying the dead.